So we have Angie Burleson with us today. She's from the Arizona ACEs Consortium. Probably, I don't know, maybe 2 months ago, she presented this training to our adult remand, our extended jurisdiction kid work group with AOC. And Natalie and I were in there at the time, and we just knew this was information that would be super helpful for you guys. And so we were able to bring her here today. She's actually from Kingman, so that's awesome. But she's going to be able to give us this training about some impacts of trauma. I think you're going to be able to see signs in your kids. You're going to be like, oh, that makes sense, or that's why this, that kind of thing. Please do take notes. If you're a detention staff, you will stay after with me and we have worksheets. We'll fill it afterwards and have some discussion. For the outer offices, if you can't hear, let us know. And if you do have questions, if you want to just text me during that, it's going to be a lot easier. We can do it that way and I can ask the questions. And then also for the outer staff, if supervisors from the office can just do a sign-in attendance sheet, and that way we have that so we can all get CoJet credit as well. So, okay, so Angie, here it is. You're welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. All right, let's just get started if it will let me toggle through. I'm going to start kind of with an invitation. Talking about trauma a lot of times is not easy, right? Not only do we recognize it in ourselves and others that we know, but also in the people that we work with. You work in a highly traumatized population. You just do. We will look at that when it comes to stats. So at times it may be uncomfortable. We just invite that you walk into that uncomfortable and also understand that we all have different stories that bring us here. If you've been trained on trauma or ACEs, can you please raise your hand? Okay. Is there anybody in here that when I say ACEs, they do not know what I'm talking about?
So doing a little bit of group agreements, take space, make space, know that all opinions, all thoughts are welcome. We all come with a different story. We all have had different experiences in our lives. And there's not one right way to honestly look at all of this. We ask that you bring just kind of intention of space. We all have a lot going on, me including, that we can just be in this space. And then practice patience, not only with yourselves and others, but especially with me, especially being tethered here. It may be a little bit issue, and then be open to getting out of your comfort zone. When we talk about trauma, we have to talk about stress. And we kind of have this notion that stress is a bad thing, and stress is not overall bad. Stress is good. Stress is when my alarm goes off and I realize that I'm running late in the morning, that it pumps me full of cortisol and gets me up and gets me moving instead of lethargic and slow, right? We all have an optimal stress zone, where that is where we have just enough stress that's going to keep us motivated. It keeps us in that kind of achievement zone and really working towards whatever our goals are. And then we all kind of go over that into that negative stress space. That is where we are in that excessive stress spot. You will also hear it as toxic stress, right? And toxic stress is when you are in that excessive space and it's unmitigated. So you're in that excessive space for a long period of time and you don't have time to kind of rest, relax, right? And kind of regulate your system. That is where that excessive stress is. That is where the toxic stress is. Toxic stress also is where you do not have support around you, right? So when we talk about kiddos and when we talk about adults who have experienced a lot of toxic stress in their life, it means that they have been in this excessive stress space with no mitigation, with no adult caring support around them for a long period of time. And that is where we see the impacts on what that looks like in our system, right? This is also important for us as the adult supports around, especially if we're working with juveniles, that if we are in this negative stress space, right, if we're in this excessive stress space, that we are not the best support that we can be. And so that's just good. Any questions on the kind of that stress piece to it? We're going to go into a little bit about what happens in our system. Like, this is what happens to every single human. The only way you get out of this is if you are not human, is when you are in that stress system in your body, you are going to go into fight or flight. It's what every human does, is how our bodies are designed. And what that looks like physically, right, is we can see pupils dilate, we can see saliva production slows down, our digestion slows down, our heart rate quickens, our lungs, we take the short breaths, right? Because thinking about it, if we are stressed, if we are in an emergency situation, we don't need to be all relaxed and taking long, deep breaths. We don't need to be thinking about what we had for breakfast. We don't need to be digesting what we had for breakfast, because we may not make it past this point, right? And that is what our body senses. Our body senses we are in a life or death situation. It may not actually be a life or death situation, because our brain doesn't understand what is real and what is perceived. If it is perceived that it is dangerous, your body is going to respond in that way in case it is real. And so all of these pieces happen into our physical body. This is why you will see impacts in physical health when we have extreme stress and toxic stress. You'll see a lot of those responses. Other things that can put us into this, right, are traumatic events. That's going to result in an overactivation of our system. And understanding that this is something that we don't have control over. We don't have a cognitive thought that says, oh, this is dangerous. Body, can you please do these things, right? This is something that the brain says without our awareness, you are in danger. I am going to do all of these things for us. Our bodies are hardwired for survival. That's just it. That's how we are designed. And so what happens is, when we are stressed, our body is going to do things that helps us survive in that moment. Okay. This is across the board. We cannot get away from this. It just happens. And yeah, and there's no kind of escaping it. So what does this look like just in normal, everybody? Our window of tolerance, that's our safety zone. That's our achievement zone that we saw on the optimal stress slide, right? This is the place where we're at our best. This is the place where we're thinking. This is the place that we're actually present in the moment, kind of pieces. When something happens and our body senses that there's danger, or we are dysregulated, or our body is over that optimal threshold and we're in that negative stress spot, our body is just going to respond. Everybody's responses look different. Some people will automatically go in fight or flight. Some people will automatically go into freeze. Some people will do a combination, a back and forth of each one of these. It is whatever that body created as a child to keep them safe. What you see most often, now some of this is changing, but what we have seen most often is males will typically go into the fight or flight. Females, especially those who have experienced sexual abuse in their past, are going to go into the freeze. You are going to see a lot of dissociation. It can look like compliance, right? It can look like the good girls that don't have any issues. It can look like the ones where there's a lot of chaos going around them and they're just kind of calm in it, right? Almost as if it has no effect on them because they're in that dissociated space. Now, we are seeing that, and I'm sure you all can attest to this, that we are seeing an increase in fight or flight behaviors in the female population, juvenile. that we kind of did not see in previous years. Could not tell you what that is about, except maybe societal, right? The way that we look at some things. But when we're in that fight or flight space, that's going to look like all of those things we see, right? All of those behaviors that we have to kind of mitigate, where we'll see outbursts, we'll see anger, crying, fear, frustration, all of those pieces. This is something we all do, right? This is something all humans do. The reason that we talk about this is because if we have experienced trauma, if we come from an environment that our body is constantly on and in one of these or all of these spaces and not in that window of tolerance, we are gonna see these behaviors even more, right? And it's really, this is all just kind of an understanding of where some of these behaviors come to. When we talk specifically about juveniles, we have to understand what the teenage brain looks like. And how it's different from our adult spaces, right? They may be doing adult things, but their development is not in that adult space. Some of the ones that are really important, at least kind of for us, is that prefrontal cortex, right? Where that's where the planning and reasoning piece is. That right there is actually prone, not even prone, it is hardwired for risk behaviors. Because who in their right mind as a teenager would become an adult if we weren't set up to take risks, right? Being an adult is not what it's cracked up to be. What all of my adult children will tell me, like, this really kind of sucks. And I'm like, I told you. And you didn't believe me, right? Because their brains were hardwired for that high risk. Now add in that we live in an extreme culture, right? Where like high risk sports, extreme behaviors, that is something that we all have access to on a regular basis. We have social media, we have internet, which constantly hits those spaces in those kids. And so we're being more, we're in that kind of immature, high risk behavior space a lot longer than we would be right back in, I will say, in the day. My older kids are 21 to 25. My younger kids are 11 to 15. And so my older kids, they didn't have smartphones. Smartphones were actually not a thing when they were in junior high and the beginning of high school. It was still like the slider phones with the QWERTY keyboard that some of the young people might not know what I'm talking about. In their kind of time, where my younger kids have had smartphones and access to the YouTube videos that are loud and fast and are constantly activating our brain, right? The way that they respond in this world is a lot different than the way that my older kids respond. And so understanding that this is where they're at brain development wise, right? They're making really dumb decisions. But they make that because they need to learn the consequences of those dumb decisions, right? We just live in a society right now that we have a lot of high stake natural consequences that come from some really dumb decisions that we kind of were able to make under the radar years past, right? And so understanding kind of where that learning is. When it comes to talking about trauma, trauma is not an event, okay? Trauma is the experience a person's body has and holds on to from the event. It is something that happens when that experience is so powerful, it overcomes that person's ability to cope. Okay, that is what trauma is. So it's not just having the physical abuse, right? It's not just having the death in the family. It is the experience that that person faces from that event. And there's so many different factors that go into that. right? What kind of support systems they had around them, what personal coping skills did they have. So we'll have the event, right? The experience of the event, and then the effect of the event. Trauma is that, can be that effect, right? I used the example of when my older kids, when my son was 16, his sister was 12. He needed to go to O'Reilly's for a part for his truck, and he took his sister with him. This was like one of the first times that she had ever gone with her brother on an errand, and she was all excited. They were going to go out to lunch, and they get in a car accident and totals my van. My van at the time had no AC, so the windows were down. Obviously, my son was driving. It was a very bad accident. And my son walked away from, thankfully, neither one of them was physically hurt. But my son walked away with it, with appearing to have no effects from it, right? Long-term effects from it. He went to work the next morning at 4:30 in the morning, like he always did. My 12-year-old, on the other hand, though, had a completely indifferent experience from that car wreck, right? For weeks afterwards, she could not, she had to travel with earphones in at the highest rate because she couldn't hear the traffic around her. Her experience of the accident was she saw it was about to happen. She trusted that her brother saw it, which he had not, right? And then she heard everything around there. And she had no control in the situation. Plus, she was 12 years old, right? A little bit less mature than my 16-year-old son. Their experiences of the event completely opposite, right? I mean, she's 21 now, and she just now, literally just now, started driving where she can crack the window and hear the air. Otherwise, when you drove with her, you just had to drive in just stuffiness because she couldn't have any airflow coming across because of the experience that she had, right? She still is the only person who drives. The only person that she has driven with since that accident 9 years ago is me and my current husband. Because that is just how that experience happened to her, right? I'm pretty sure my son just still feels bad for totaling our only vehicle. And that was like the only experience he had. So then we add ACEs into the mix, right? And ACEs is just a study. It was done in the late 90s by Dr. Folletti and the CDC. The reason that this study was done is he had a weight loss clinic. He had all of these all-stars who would lose hundreds of pounds, and then 6 months later, they'd gain all the weight. And in the follow-up questions, he had incorrectly asked a question, and through that realized that this woman had experienced child sexual abuse. And so then he asked all the rest of them the same question and realized that all of the women that had been his all-stars that lost all this weight and then gained it all back, they had all experienced child sexual abuse in their past. And so he connected with the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, which is an insurance agent out of California, to just see what kind of impacts do childhood experiences have on adult health, right? What does that look like? And they just looked at 10 rather simple things. 5 in the abuse category, 5 in the household category, right? Do you live with a parent who's incarcerated? Do you live with a parent who has a mental illness? Have you experienced your parent being treated violently? Do you have one or no parents? And then the abuse piece, right? Have you experienced physical, emotional, sexual abuse, or physical or emotional neglect? For lack of better terms, if you said yes, you got a point. The highest ACE score you can have is 10. The lowest ACE score you can have is 0. And what they found from that is that as the ACEs increased, so did exponentially your chances for smoking, all physical health degrees, and all behavioral health issues, right? So this is from the original study. And this is really only looking at Caucasian, over the age of 55 with private insurance in California at the time when they did this. It doesn't look at any of the other environmental impacts around, right? And what that kind of looks like. But they did see that as you increased in ACEs, your chances, your risk factor increased also exponentially, right? From no ACEs to 1 in 480 uses IV drugs, just even 1 to 3 ACEs, you're looking at 1 in 43. Now think about the kiddos that you work with. How many of them have substance use in their family? Right? That's 1 ACE right there. Now, how many of them have experienced a parent that has been incarcerated or has mental illness? Right? When we look at the kind of the impacts of trauma, when we look at the impacts of really of toxic stress, we know that it is that intergenerational piece. We know that if a parent has, say, an ACE score of 3, that the chances are that that child is then going to have an even greater ACE score than that parent did, because we're just passing down the stuff that we know, right? And the way that we know how to cope. Are there any questions on this, or does anything kind of stick out for you that was like, oof, I didn't realize it would be that high? I do want to point out that a lot of this stuff is behavioral stuff that's on there, except of course the heart disease piece that's on there. When it comes to ACEs across the board, all physical health issues increase. Stroke, heart disease, all of those pieces. Because as we saw at the beginning, the more stress that we have on our system, that stress system is going to be activated for a longer period of time. There's only so long that we can let our engine revving without stopping it, right? Without having impacts to it. So what does this look like for adults in the justice system? And I'm sure that none of these stats come as a surprise to you, right? 98% of female offenders have experienced trauma, often interpersonal and domestic violence. 75% of adults in substance use treatment report histories of trauma. 93% of homeless moms have a lifetime history of trauma. And then, of course, in public behavioral health, over 90% of clients have experienced trauma, right? We work with a highly traumatized population, and I'm sure that that actually comes as no surprise to any of you, and kind of the experiences that you've had in it. So what does some of this actually look like in action? Like, what are some of the things that we kind of experience when in the people and in us who have had either high levels of traumas or even just experiences are in that traumatic space, right? That dysregulated space. We have our emotional dysregulation space, right? The overwhelm, numb, mood swings, shutdown, outbursts. Our physical somatic changes. Somatic is just a fancy way to say the stuff that happens in our body. Nausea, chronic pain. How many have kids here? How many of them do your children not have a single stomach ache the entire summer as they're eating Cheetos, hot Cheetos, and Hot Pockets? But the moment we go to school, we have a stomach ache, right? That is a normal stress reaction in their body. You can see that ones that have experienced high levels of trauma, however, are going to have some of these chronic pains. They are going to have other physical health symptoms, because your body can only run for so long, right? Before it starts to shut down. We need to have some of that space for regulation, and really just a moment for it to breathe, right? What cognitively, what does that look like? It looks like a lot of brain fog, because, well, when you have a lot going on, right, it's easy to kind of have that brain full there. Memory loss, intrusive thoughts, feeling different from others, right? Our normal activations, what that looks like for everyone, and dissociation, a lot of those in the cognitive. What I kind of want to focus on is this behavioral piece to it, because this is what you all experience on the regular, right? And not only do you experience it once, whatever brought them in here for the first time, you experience repeated scenes of theirs where you're thinking, maybe you're not, why don't you get this? Why do you keep doing the same stuff over and over and over again and expecting a different result? We've already laid out what is going to happen. And yet you continue to respond doing the same stuff. Like, what did you think was going to happen, right? What happens when children experience high levels of trauma in their homes? Do children have choices over where they live, who they live with, what they do, right? But they have to survive. And so what happens is their brains create this safety template. We all have them, right? We're hardwired for survival. We are hardwired for safety. If there is extreme neglect, if there is trauma in the house that is happening on the regular, children cannot escape this. They need to say, okay, this is safe, this is fine. This is just how my life is, and I'm okay with that, right? Because what's the alternative? What's the alternative to that? That then becomes their safety template. That doesn't just go away. That's their template for the rest of their life until they have mitigation, until they have intervention. And that intervention needs to look like therapy. That mitigation needs to look like leaving the environment for a long extended period of time, where their body then becomes regulated, and then they can create new patterns that feel safe to them. So what happens is we take them out of the environment, or they do something that moves them out of the environment. They still have that safe template. They say, danger feels safe to me. Self-sabotage feels safe, because who has control over self-sabotage? Me, right? And I need that in order for me to feel safe. I am in risk taking because releasing that cortisol and putting my body into that stress system, that's what I'm used to. That's what actually makes me feel good, right? Having terrible relationships, right? Interpersonal relationships. When that was what your template was growing up, that is what actually feels safe to you. Now, you go into a quote safe relationship, what we would say is safe, right? Where things are not chaotic, things are not happening, their body is not stressed on the regular. That feels really dangerous. First of all, it's foreign and they've never felt it before. Second of all, when things went calm in a very chaotic household, she was about to go down. That was never a good time. That was where they didn't know what was happening next. See, if it's chaotic all the time, you can start to predict what that chaos is going to tell you, right? When mom comes home and she's like this, I know to do this. Now, if mom is all of a sudden calm, and she's calm for an extended period of time, and there isn't that back and forth, they're not quite sure what to do with it, right? This is why we see them consistently repeat these behaviors over again, because as backwards as it feels and seems to us and looks to us, that is what actually makes their bodies feel safe. I am 49 years old. I met my husband 5 years ago now. And it took me so long, because of my traumatic background from childhood through adulthood, took me so long to realize, wow, he's just really nice. Like, he's nice all the time. Nice. He never like raises his voice and gets mad, and there's none of that stuff. And I waited, right, for a very long time. Just now is it to the point like I actually think like this is just kind of who he is. Now, all experiences in the last 5 years would have told us that. However, I'm so used to being there that the beginning of the relationship, whew, did I test him? And he was still nice. But even at my age, with all of the interventions that I have had, I am in recovery from alcohol use disorder and opioid use disorder. And what I like to say, in recovery from myself, because of all of the self-sabotage behaviors that I would do, right, for years, 20 years worth of healing, and it's still, right, is just a very difficult thing. Understanding that this is just how our bodies function. And that was really key for me to understand kind of healing, right? And what does that look like? When we believe an individual has complete control over their behavior, we are more likely to be angry when that behavior is inappropriate. This does not mean a free pass. This is not like, oh, you've experienced a lot of trauma, you're allowed to act like a total a-hole. No, not in any way, shape, or form, right? This is just for us to understand that there are things behind the behaviors so that we know better how to support them. And honestly, so we stop taking things personally. The behavior has nothing to do with us, right? It has to do with the experience that they have had and how their bodies respond. So before we move into kind of like, what are some of the things that we can do? Are there any questions on those trauma pieces? Okay. So what do we do, right? We really need to focus on creating safety. And what safety looks like for one is not what safety looks like for others, right? It needs to look not only physical safe, but emotionally safe. And that emotionally safe place is really us. Like, what does that look like to support? So at the beginning, we saw the impacts of ACEs, right? All studies have shown us that just one safe, supportive, caring adult can actually mitigate the impacts of ACEs and mitigate the impacts of trauma. It's why I can stand up here and talk to you all with an ACE score of 8 and with the background that I came from because of one safe, supportive adult that was in my life growing up, right? It's why I have been successful, right, in my life, and why I was able to even find recovery in spaces, because of those adults. And so, but what we don't talk about is, what does that look like, right? Like, what does that mean to be that adult? And kind of these are some of the things that we can do, right? Is looking at how are we communicating? What are some effective communication skills? We know that people with trauma come in very distrustful, and rightfully so, because that has been their experience. And a lot of adults have let them down in their life, right? So why would you be any different? Why would you be any different? We look at the difference between self-control and self-regulation. Self-control is get it together, Ange, right? It is like, you have this thing to do, you're in this, it does not make a difference how you're feeling, just get it together and do it. Self-regulation says, is something else going on, right? Am I dysregulated from something, right? And then taking steps to regulate myself. A lot of times having these presentations is activating for me because we talk about trauma consistently. Coming from a high trauma background, at times that's not easy for me, right? And I do live in this world, and we know that life never stops. So it's not, yeah, so it can be. So when I look at that self-control versus self-regulation, is, am I going to take that minute to step back and take a breath to bring me back into this space, right? And we also need to look at attachment, because this is the way that people create relationships. And everybody's attachment style is a little bit different. What we see in our justice involved individuals across the board, they all have an insecure attachment style. It makes it really hard for them to create relationships, right? And y'all are having relationships with them whether you want to or not, because you're interacting with them, right? We're trying to create that safety there in a very unsafe world for them. And so what that looks like, right, was we have all of these different attachment styles, and some of them are going to push you away, and some of them are going to be really needy, right? And then some of them are going to be in that in between where they're giving you kind of both of those, right? Where they're really needy in one thing and then they're pushing you away in another. That's just their attachment style. And what your attachment style is going to interplay with that, right? Just because we have a disorganized or insecure attachment as a child does not mean that we cannot get to a secure attachment phase as adults, right? Although I had a disorganized and insecure attachment as a child and for very many of my adult years, through mitigation and through work on myself, I was able to get into that space where I can now have secure attachments, right? But it just took a little bit of work and understanding from those that are around. So these are some of the things that you are going to kind of experience with others. And I lay this foundation here because when we talk about effective communication skills, when we talk about creating safety, it's really important to understand that looks different for everyone, and the way you're going to get there may look a little bit different, right? And so you may not be able to respond to everybody exactly the same to get the exact same results. That safety first obviously starts with trust in a population that is incredibly distrustful. And how we do that, how we be that trustworthy person, is consistency, reliability, stability, and predictability. Everybody has the same consequences. Just because you have a high experience of trauma does not mean that your consequences look different than the next person's. That is how we learn stability. That is how we learn predictability. When we know what's going to happen if we do X, Y, Z. We know that when you show up in my space, that you are going to present in a certain way. And that way is the same the vast majority of time. Does that mean that we cannot be human and have our off days? No. But what it means is in this population, if we want to create that trust, if we want them to be able to trust us, that we need to be able to own when we're not in that space, right? Like when we are just having an off day, whatever that looks like. A lot of times when I talk about this, I talk about a time when my youngest son was 4. He obviously had a very different growing up than my older kids did. I didn't get into recovery the first time until my kids were 6, 5, 2, my old ones. My youngest one had me in recovery his whole entire life. And he was about 6 at the time. And I was having a fight with my youngest daughter at the time, who was in high school. And I come into the bedroom and my son goes, I just don't understand Caden's life. I'm like, what do you mean you don't understand Caden's life? And he's like, well, I just don't understand why you were yelling at her. And I'm all, well, she was disrespectful and she wasn't listening. And he goes, oh, so it's your fault. You couldn't control your emotions. And I was like, listen here, little one. While that might actually be true, I don't need to know that, right? You don't have to point it out. But it was true, right? I gave myself way more timeouts than my children ever got because I realized that I was the one factor I could control. And the more dysregulated I got, the more dysregulated they got. And then we just spun. We spun, right? And I was the only one who could stop that. And I needed to be that way, that safe. I needed to be able to say, hey, I really messed up and I'm sorry. You know, I have all of this stuff going on, not an excuse, but this is just kind of how humans are, right? And so being able to establish that piece is so crucial when it comes to having that relationship. What the other opportunity you all have is the vast majority of your clients and the people that you are working with have never experienced someone who is regulated. They have no idea what a coping skill is outside of typically substance use, fighting, things that get their cortisol up, right? But a calm, healthy coping skill is not something that they have usually had. That is going to come from modeling, right? They learned those coping skills from modeling, and now they're going to learn healthier coping skills from you all. This is how we build that safety and that trust, right? What are you doing? How regulated are you coming into this space? What does your body placement look like? Right? Is it too much eye contact? Is it not enough for that person? What does that look like? What is your tone? What is your speed of speech? Right? These are all things that we have the ability to come in with, right? If my son is super overwhelmed and has a lot going on and I come in just guns a-blazing and I'm all loud and animated, all I'm going to do is dysregulate him more, right? And so we have that ability to be able to be that person to model that regulation where they know that that's even possible. This provides choices. When we have experienced a lot of trauma, we typically have not had choice in any of that, right? Choice gives us ownership over the things. A lot of times there's not choices that we can make. There's certain rules that we have, right? It actually doesn't have to be a choice. It just has to be a perceived choice, right? We are sitting down in this room. Would you like to sit facing the door? Would you like to sit either way or sitting, right? Like, where is it you would like to kind of sit down? Like choices like that, where is that really a choice? I mean, either way you're sitting down, but it feels like a choice to us, right? That gives them ownership, and that gives them a feeling of control in this space, especially as we are kind of learning, right? Especially as we are kind of learning. So what does it look like to be that kind of safe support? We're practicing and modeling self-care, regulation. This has a wide open window of tolerance. That window of tolerance is really how much capacity do you have to handle the stuff that's in your life and going on around. All of our capacity looks different, right? All of our capacity looks different. Some of us can handle an extreme amount of stuff in that window of tolerance space before it dysregulates us. Some of us cannot handle as much, right? Everybody's window of tolerance looks completely different. The one thing that looks the same is when we are outside of our window of tolerance, we are going to be activated and in fight or flight, freeze or fawn, right? It's going to be one of those. And that's what it's going to look like for the people you work with too, right? Not only the clients that you have, but your coworkers. And when we understand that window of tolerance, we're able to understand when to approach people, right? When to not. Is this really the best time to have this conversation? The other day, my husband's like, oh, I have all of these great ideas. And I was already dysregulated. And he looks at me and I was like, my head is just really full with work right now. Like, I don't know. And he's like, and he just continues to go on. He's all excited. And it is like, oh my gosh, that is a lot of stuff. Okay. And we get to the end. He goes, I watched your face go from like, yeah, good to, and I'm all, yeah, because it was a lot. And now I need to go out to the patio for a minute to just kind of take some space, right? So it's just, that's just how humans are, of having those conversations. And so understanding that there's different spaces for us to be able to have them, right? What does that look like when we're communicating? What does that look like? That which makes us good at and committed to this work is also what makes it challenging. We all have our stories. There's a reason we're here. Y'all are not doing easy work. You all are working a very difficult population. You're not making hundreds of thousands of dollars. None of us are. We work in a very overworked and understaffed industry. It is very stressful. right? There's a reason you're doing this. That story and those reasons, that's actually what makes you really good at doing your work, but it's also what makes it really hard, right? A lot of us may have experienced some of the same things that these kiddos have gone through, and that's why we're here. Just because we have experience and we have made it through, we may have this idea of what that looks like for them, right? We need to understand that it looks different for everybody, because although you made it through, although I made it through, my life and my experiences, the support that was around me, the things that I had going for me were way different than some other people. Does it mean that they don't have a chance? Not in any way, shape, or form, right? It's just is maybe going to look a little bit different. And maybe you are that person that is going to be that support, and they're going to be, when as an adult, you know, standing up and being like, actually the only reason that I'm here standing here is because of, right, my probation officer when I was a juvie. There's lots of people that in working in the substance use field that have that story. I have talked to them, right? I've met them. Y'all have a really important job, and it is incredibly thankless. And it is incredibly stressful, right? And so understanding, how does all of this stuff just even apply to us? What does this look like in my own system? What are some of the things that I can do to kind of prevent these impacts, right? We are way more susceptible to burnout and compassion fatigue because of the vicarious trauma that we experience on the regular. That is hearing and that is witnessing other people's stories, right? And what that kind of looks like. One of the key things that we can do is kind of complete that stress cycle for all of us, right? We can only run for so long. We can only be on for so long. We have to complete that stress cycle. And so what does that look like for us? And everybody is going to have a different way to do that, right? What are some of the things that we can, in our interactions with others, when they are dysregulated, what are some of the things that we can naturally add in, right? Crying, we tend to stop that when people are doing it because it makes us incredibly uncomfortable. Crying is completing the stress cycle for that system, though. That is a natural thing. Shaking, you know, when you're mad, when you're super mad and your body just starts shaking, we've all been there, we've all felt that. That is your body actually naturally completing the stress cycle. When we have had, say, just narrowly missed a car accident and we're shaking, that is your body releasing all of that and letting that go. That is completing that stress cycle so that it doesn't, like with my daughter, stay in their system, right? So what are some of the things that we can do? First, we have to give ourselves permission to do it. A lot of us have not had these permissions, right? This is not something big. This isn't like go take a bath, you know, go, you know, meditate on the mountain. No, this is give yourself time to regulate, to decompress so that you can handle the rest of the stuff that comes up, right? In between work and home. Is there a time for you to decompress and let all the crap that you've experienced at work, right, not come home with you, right? Give yourself some space. Understand that we all can only do so much, and being able to say no. No is a complete sentence. There needs no explanation. That was like life-changing for me. This, if you wanted to take, I'm going to share the recording and also share the slides with all of you, but this is some of the things that you can even talk to with your clients, right? And what does this look like? Having them create, remember, they are learning brand new things. They are learning brand new things. we need to practice them over and over, and we are going to fail over and over, and that's okay. We just practice over and over. Our brain, we used to think that once we had brain injuries, or that once a person was the way that they were, that there was nothing we can do. We realize that is not the truth, right? We have neuroplasticity. We're all able to change behavioral patterns. And what is that word? It's gone. But compare, good gracious, to like when you're at the beach and when you run your fingers through sand, you don't have to put any more pressure on it, but that gap gets wider and wider, right? It gets deeper and deeper in there. That's what our brain does. So the more often we practice, that's where that strength and that wiring comes in. And so it kind of takes them time. But when we're activated, we can't think, oh, I should probably take a breath. I'm like pushing my kid up against the wall, screaming in their face because I'm so activated, right, in that moment. It's not until I'm able to like recognize, it's like, ooh, and then I can pull myself back. I had to practice, right, over and over. What does that feel like in my body? I had never been in my body before. I did not know what that looked like, right? I am a heavy dissociator. And so these were things that I never even knew before. And this is things a lot of your clients just have never even known what that feels like. My husband can explain, like when he gets angry, what it feels like in his body. He's been in recovery from IV heroin use since 19, and he's 59 now. And he will say, it gets hot and it just rises and it rises. And I know that the moment that heat gets to my chest, I better get out. Because if I don't get out, it's going over my chest and, well, I'm picking him up from you all. Because he knows, right, that is where it is. But it took him a long time to learn what that looks like. And so having them be able to look at what do you need? What can that look like, right? What are some of the things that we can have in our system? And what are some of the things that actually work for you? Everybody's looks different, right? Mine is breathing because it just is, well, the easiest, and I have a lot of stuff going on. If you ask me to take a bath to relax, that's disgusting to me. I'm not a bath person. It feels like I'm stewing in my own filth, and it does not do that for me, right? But there are people that they are all about it, and they're like, oh no, that doesn't work, right? So you find what works for you, right? And they need to find what works for them. And so it may be a lot of that, examples of what we can do in that. So always remember, if your compassion does not include yourself, it is incomplete. We are the only people that we have. Your life is not worth your job. Your life is not worth all of those stressors and things that are out there, right? Whatever that looks, whatever we need to add into our daily routine, might take a bit to get there, and it might change over time, and that is fine. Please do it, because you do have really important jobs, and you really are affecting future generations so that they have a chance that maybe the other ones that have not touched your space have. Any questions? That was a lot in a very short period of time. Phew.